Welcome to the JSON file Unity tutorial. We're going to talk about using JSON to save and load data. JSON actually stands for a JavaScript object notation. It's used in a lot of web programming. It's kind of replacing XML on the web programming side. It's lighter weight. It's actually a lot less text. The other benefit is that JSON has a class-like structure. So those of you who understand classes, you'll understand JSON pretty easily, and allows nested hierarchies of classes as well. So you can have classes within classes. You can use arrays. It's a very flexible format, and I actually prefer to use this for saving my files. It is a text-based format, so you have to be careful that users don't edit the files. And if they do, you have to protect yourself to make sure your program doesn't crash if they do edit the file improperly. In future tutorials, we'll talk about ways of preventing or finding out whether or not users can actually edit those text files through hashing or encryption. But that's more than I want to cover today. So JSON, again, JavaScript object notation. A couple versions ago, Unity, I think it was around 5, Unity version 5, Unity added support for JSON called JSON Utility. And once that happened, we didn't have to use third-party libraries anymore like Newtonsoft, which is good because now it's built in natively to Unity. So let me do a quick example of how to use JSON. I'm just going to make a JSON data class. And I'm just going to throw this on my main camera. Just so we have something to play with here. Now, one of the big questions when saving files to Unity is where do you save them? And you need to be careful about where you save your data. On a Windows computer, it doesn't really matter too much, but if you're making this for a mobile device, then you have a limited area where you are allowed to save your files. Unity provides a constant called application.persistent data path. This is the location of a folder on the computer or mobile device that your data can be saved into. It is available for you to read and write data from. And it is strictly for your app or game, as it may be. Let me just do a quick example of where this is. Now I'm using a Windows computer. On Mac, it'll be, and mobile, it'll be somewhere else. So now that I've saved it, let me just run this real quick. Now that it's running, I can see where it's saying the application persistent path is. And it is actually in my users, under my username. Then it's in app data, which is typically a hidden folder. So if you can't see it, you need to actually change your file settings so you can see hidden folders. App data, local low, default company, and then this GPA JSON files is the name of my Unity project. The reason it says default company is because in my settings, my build settings, under player, company name is set to default company. So once you're really ready to publish your own game, you're going to want to change the company name, the product name, and that'll actually change this path. So you can keep a little bit more of a professional have more of a professional experience once you fill that in properly with your company name. Even if it's just your personal name, it's better than saying default company. Also, anybody who doesn't change the default company, this is where Unity just sticks a lot of stuff in general. So if you have a lot of test applications on you're going to find a lot of things in there. In fact, I just cleaned mine up recently. I have like 40 or 50 different things in there I had to delete. So that's where the default company comes from. One thing important to notice that this is a folder. It does not have a trailing slash on it. So when we actually want to use it, we're going to have to add a slash to it. So let me actually create a file name to use. And the file name I want to use for this, we'll just call it data.json. But then I'm going to create a path. And the reason I'm going to create the path is so I don't have to continuously recreate it as I'm using this. And I'm just going to make it in start. And path is going to be application persistent data plus I have to add in a slash plus the file name. Now if I display this path, it'll be a file name that we can now read and write from. So users Greg, app data local load, default company, GPA JSON files, / data.json. So now it is a valid file. So now I have a file that I can now read and write from. Now JSON is completely text based, and so we can read and write text. But the way that JSON utility works is that it actually takes a class and it serializes that class, which basically means it takes all the public contents and pushes all that out. So when we make a class, and even we make public will be serialized, meaning those fields will be the ones that are saved to the file. And those are the ones that when we read back in will be read back in and saved. Anything we do not want pushed out, those are the ones that we'll make private and they won't actually be saved. So we can then differentiate what will and will not be saved based on whether it's public or private. So now we need to make our JSON information class, and I don't want it to be a mono behavior, so we can't use the JSON data class that we have here. So I'm going to create one called game data. And this game data script and class is what's going to be used to store our data that we want to save to disk. Also, like I said, it's not going to be a mono behavior, so I'm going to remove update and start from it. And this is the data that I want to save. So depending upon what your game is, what your purpose is, what you're trying to save, this is what will go in here. So for now, I'm just going to actually save the date. And default it to nothing. And I might as well save the time as well, just so we can see it with two different fields. The last thing you have to do is that you have to make this class serializable. So system.serializable. And that becomes important when we want to do class aggregation, which is nesting one class in another. When we want to do that with serialization, it has to be serializable. And we're going to do that in a minute. For now, we're going to go to JSON data. Create a game data class. And just for starters, I will make an empty one. And then I want a save data function and a read data function. And then just so I can test it out, if input get key down key code S for save, that's when I'll save data. And if I hold down key code R for read data, that's when we'll read the data. So we have our path. Now let's do save data first, because until we do save data, there's nothing to read back. So saving data is actually pretty easy. We create a string called contents, and from here we're actually going to use JSON utility. To JSON, and it takes an object, and the object is the information we want to save. So this is going to be the game data variable that we defined up here, and that object is then going to be turned into a string in JSON format. Now, for now, I'm going to say true because I want it to print pretty, which will add extra spacing and make it a little bit more readable, and that way we can actually look at it and see what it's doing. And from there, system IO, file, write all text, set it to our path, which has application persistent data path plus the file name, and then the contents of the file. And that will write everything to a file. Well, let's go and test it real quick. And hit the S key. And just to make sure it worked, we'll actually go to the folder. So users, Greg, app data, local load, default company, GPA JSON files, and there it is, data.json. And we can open it up in a text editor. And there's our class. It has the date and the time. Now the structure of the JSON file, it has the name of the field or the variable. So these are the public variables. If you remember from game data, we had date and time. There's the date and the time. And then because they're strings, and there were empty strings by default, it's using quotes. And to separate the data from the value is a colon. And now JSON requires a comma between fields. So from here, we could now read this back in, which isn't going to do a lot of good because we don't actually have any data in there. So let's go actually change that data and save data. So game data.date equals system date time now to short date string and game data.time system date time now, which will get the current. So the first one gets the current date, and this is going to get the current time, and fill those in. So now when we run it and save that data, it should actually save that information to the file. So there's the save, reload, and now it has the current date and the current time of when I did the saving. So now that we have data in there, we can read that data back. So reading the data back is just the reverse of how we wrote the data. So string contents equals system IO file read all text and the path, and that's going to read in all the text. And then game data equals JSON utility dot from JSON, and there's two versions, and the version I want to use is the one with the chevrons, the arrows, and we put the name of the class that we're filling in. So game data is the class that we want to use to read in, and then the JSON, which is just the contents of the file, we'll read that in. And then let's just log that to the console. Game data dot date plus game data dot time. So we can actually see that it works. So to read the data in, we hit R, and there is the time and date from the file. So 10/12/2017 at 2:01 p.m., which is right there, 2:01 p.m. We save the data, hit S, and I read it back. And now it's 2 minutes later, it's 2:03 p.m., which is the new contents of the file, which it hasn't registered that it's changed yet. There it goes. So there was the new contents. That's from when I resaved it. So now we have the data being read back. Now, one little caveat to working with files and working with JSON is files can be edited by the user or the player because they're just on the hard disk. And they could delete the file. They could change the contents of the file. They may even break the file to the point where you can't read it. If the file doesn't exist and you try to read the contents, you'll get an error. If the file isn't in the right format, meaning they've changed the JSON somehow, and you try to convert it using from JSON, you'll get an error. By error, I mean you'll get an exception. Unity's pretty good about catching exceptions, and it won't crash the game, but it will make it so you're unable to actually read the data. So before trying to read the data, you want to know if the file exists. So system.io file exists, path. If the file exists, then you can go ahead and read it. Otherwise, you can tell the user, in this case I'm just going to log a message, but you'd probably want to do something in your game to tell the user that you were unable to read the data, unable to read the saved data file does not exist. And then you may want to reset the data to a brand new state, or keep the existing state. However, this only catches the exception if there's no file. What if they actually change the contents of the file? If they change the contents of the file and it messes with how the file works, you want to use what's called a try catch, which is exception handling. Exception EX. It's actually system.exception. Exception. And if something bad happens, you can tell the user and recover from it. EX message, letting the user know, hey, I couldn't read your file, or something tampered with your file, or your file was corrupted. In this case, it'll actually give you the error message, whatever it is, which unfortunately tends to not be very human readable. So it's usually better to trap the appropriate exception, but I don't want to go into too much detail on exception handling right now. But you can trap the appropriate exceptions so that you can get a little bit more information on what's going on. So now that we've protected ourselves, we can go ahead and use this with a little bit more secure in the knowledge that it's not going to break our game. Now, technically speaking, we're done, except there's one little caveat I want to make to all of this. So I tend to use and make my own third-party tools to facilitate making games and making file entry. In a previous tutorial, I talked about using Microsoft Excel, but sometimes you just need to make your own tools and push that data out. And I prefer to use JSON as a file format to push them out. However, in order to do that, I have to use a JSON library in my tool, and I tend to use one called Newtonsoft, which isn't actually compatible with JSON utility most of the time. Because JSON utility, if you look at the file here, JSON utility just dumps the contents of the class out there and doesn't provide the class name, and it causes a little bit of a problem with the way Newtonsoft works. So what I prefer to do is I prefer to put a wrapper. And the wrapper is just an extra class. It's not going to have a lot of information in it. In fact, all it is going to hold the game data for us. Let's call it JSON Wrapper. And again, not a mono behavior, because this is going to be a serializable class, just like game data. So serializable, system serializable, public game data, and just have the variable in there. And now where I have game data in here, before I do that, I want to create a JSON wrapper and set the wrapper game data equal to this game data. And then I'm going to save the wrapper. let me just show you what that does when we actually save the file now. So save the file. And now you see how it has the game data class in there. It actually has the variable game data. And notice that this is a class, so it has a set of curly braces. So the name of the variable is game data. The value is a set of braces, which is the class, which we know because we created this class earlier. So now we have that in a format that Newtonsoft likes better. So we could now use this file interchangeably with some of the third-party tool. Of course, if I tried to read it in right now, it would break because I'm not reading this kind of thing in. So I need to create JSON wrapper from JSON wrapper, and then game data equals wrapper game data, and that will replace the current game data with the new one that's inside the wrapper that we just read in from the file. So once I go through here and read the data, and then we have the latest content, which is 2:09 p.m. at 10:12. So we have the file actually reading and writing now, and we have the proper data in there. So we have this wrapper. Also, to simplify things, you may want to move your save data and your read data into the wrapper class, especially if you want to create a more generic version of game data. I'm going to possibly even move the path and the file name in there if you wanted to, so that the wrapper has a little bit more going on of a capsulation where it has the functions that work along its own data. And because it's not a mono behavior, now you cannot serialize a mono behavior because you cannot instantiate a mono behavior through JSON, because mono behaviors must be instantiated using Unity's GameObject.instantiate. So you can never actually serialize a mono behavior because you'll never be able to do from JSON with it right here. This will never be able to instantiate a mono behavior. So that's why I use a wrapper. And you may want to move a lot of this code, like the pathing and the save and read functions, into the wrapper and make the wrapper a little bit more robust and a little bit more encapsulated. But that's merely an optional choice. So one of the other benefits that you have now is that you can actually put classes within classes and see what's some interesting game data. Let's say we had some quests. So let's make a quick quest. And again, not a mono behavior. And system serializable. And let's see, integer public, because anything serialized must be public. Publisher int ID. Actually, I'm going to skip that for now. Let's actually just go string name, then public string description, and public integer status. And I'm going to leave it at that for now. Now let's go back to JSON data. And actually, let's go into game data. So now I want to have a list of quests. So public list quest, call it quests equals new. And let's go and add some quests. So quest Q1 equals new quest. Q1.name equals deliver beer. Q1.description, deliver beer to Fred. And then let's add that quest to the game data. .quests.add Q1. And let's add another quest. Q2, deliver food to Bob, and then we'll add quest 2. So now we've added a couple of quests. When we save our data, it's actually going to be saved as JSON. There it goes. And it looks a little bit different now. Notice that there's a set of brackets here for the value. That bracket denotes an array. In our case, we used a list, which is an enumeration. It's like an array. And it's separated. Each of these are little classes of quests separated by commas. There's the deliver beer, which deliver beer to Fred, and deliver food to Bob, and both have the status, which are integers, as 0. So now we can save our quest data, and we could make changes to it or whatever we want to do with it. And to read that back in, once we read it back in, for each quest, q in game data.quests debug.log let's just print out the description. We'll just log the description. So when we read it back in, we're just going to dump everything in that list out to the console. So read, deliver beer to Fred, deliver food to Bob. So what that means is when we read this back in, when we unserialize it, it takes this quest information and it fills in this list. So now we're able to create lists of information that we can then push out to JSON and then read it back in, which gives us a lot of flexibility to create hierarchy of information and however we want to create that information. So we have a lot of power in using JSON and using aggregation to have classes, just like this has a class called game data. This has a strings and then a class of lists of class actually, which is this class here. And by making it serializable, we're able to have all that information pushed out into a file format very effectively and very easily. So it's a very versatile, JSON is very versatile, and I highly recommend using it, especially when you're trying to create saved data for your games. And you can also create JSON and use them as text assets, which I'm not going to cover today. We'll cover that in other tutorials, but you can use text assets as well, which is read-only data that's actually saved as an asset. And you can read that JSON the same exact way as you're reading these files from the persistent data path, which we're using to store information. All right, I hope this was informative for you, and talk to you later. Bye.